Unemployment. A quick Google search will describe it as the number of people who do not have a job that provides money, which isn't necessarily wrong, but it's clear that the definition was written by someone who specializes in English rather than economics. Essentially, unemployment refers to the amount of people who either cannot get a job or choose to not get a job. Now, either way, they're both bad news, but they're negative in starkly different ways. If people are unable to get a job, it can indicate lack of employment opportunities, a weak economy where businesses are unlikely to fork out money to hire more employees, an ineffective education or training system, a lack of affordable childcare, a lack of affordable transport, or a mismatch of needed and present skills. A large number of people unwilling to get a job, on the other hand, can be an indicator of unappealing wages, unappealing employment benefits, poor workplace conditions, low average state of physical and mental health, or substance usage problems. Now, regardless of what type of unemployment a country is faced with, they both share common ramifications for their nation. These include a reduced economic growth because less people are producing goods and services, less demand for goods and services because people have lower disposable income, an increase in crime as a result of social unrest and people desperate for an income source, an increase in health problems after people escape to substances or become unable to afford healthy food, a reduction in tax revenue as people are unable to meet the minimum income required, an increase in government expenditure to support those in poverty, and a wider schism between the rich and the poor. Let's take a look at this graph by Trading Economics with statistics courtesy of the ABS, which depicts Australia's past unemployment rates as a percentage since 1988, or the past 35 years. First of all, the standout illustration is that our current unemployment rate is the lowest it's ever been since these statistics began being measured. And it comes directly after one of the highest spikes in our history. Let's take a look at it. This spike in 2020 is courtesy of the COVID-19 pandemic, which drove an enormous percentage of our population out of work due to mass business closures, immigration restrictions, self-isolation mandates, as well as parents having to stay home out of work to care for their children. All of which was largely worsened by a slow reaction by the federal government as well as state premiers. This was due to a lack of experience and training for government officials in dealing with pandemics, and the fact that our country had never had any solid strategy planned for such an event. We were caught off guard. Here, we can observe the 2008 financial crisis, with an additional 2% spike in unemployment on top of the level its year before. Now, it's important to note that despite a 2% increase sounding small, in 2008 the population of Australia was at over 21 million people. So that's almost an additional 450,000 Australians out of work, which can be visualized as roughly the entire population of the ACT. One of the main reasons this occurred was because our economy is heavily reliant on exports. When the economies of the other nations declined, it meant that demand for our exports declined with them. This led to staff cuts, especially in our mining and manufacturing industries, which are our major exports. Moreover, our housing market depends highly on foreign investment, leading to additional job cuts in real estate and construction sectors. Plus, our government did not employ any major countermeasures until the recession was well underway in 2009. At the start of the 1990s, we can observe an enormous spike in unemployment, which is a direct result of the early 1990s recession. This occurred because of a freeze in economic growth in many countries over the world as well as Australia, particularly European and American. This led to a decline in the value of Australian commodities, which, when combined with another slow reaction by the government, much like the aforementioned spikes in unemployment, derailed the Australian economy and led to one of the worst unemployment rates since war times. This 11% unemployment rate, wreaking havoc on our population of 18 million at the time, put roughly 2 million Australians out of work. However, the big differentiating factor between the 2008 financial crisis and this one in the 1990s was Australia at the time of this one was undergoing several huge structural changes in the economy. The financial sector was becoming increasingly deregulated, and most of the largest government enterprises were being privatized, giving birth to Telstra and Qantas, for instance. It also followed the recent floating of the Australian dollar. Our current unemployment rate is officially 3.5%. Let's take a look at some current factors which are appealing and unappealing to Australians when it comes to working. I created a survey which was made available to students at Lumen Christi Catholic College in years 9 and above. It entailed questions aiming to obtain contemporary views on several elements of the current Australian workplace. Firstly, to gain an insight into how appealing the average Australian full-time pay in our major cities is, I displayed the ABS statistics to responders and requested opinions regarding how adequate the pay seems. The most common response at 42.9% was adequate, then followed by a neutral response and a little inadequate, both at 21.4%. And finally, 7.1% of responders viewed the pay rates as completely inadequate, and no responders at all believed them to be more than adequate. This is an alarming response, as all of the displayed salaries were at or in excess of $100,000 per year, a number which appears large even when only heard. This illustrates that a large percentage of Australians believe it is necessary for them to be earning above these pay rates. However, the problem with this is that the more employees are paid, the more money businesses lose, meaning they have to raise their prices for goods and services in order to offset that, resulting in a spiral of inflation. It's clear that simply paying people more cannot entirely fix unemployment by itself. Question 2 described childcare subsidies and requested that responders select the extent to which they agree that childcare subsidies make work more appealing to them. Completely agree and slightly agree were both the most common responses at 42.9% and 35.7% respectively. Neutral was the third most common response. However, comments conveyed that as students who do not have children, this was difficult for some to visualize. Understandable, of course. However, overall, the responses expressed that childcare subsidies are an excellent implementation and are appealing to many Australians. Moreover, with the cost of these subsidies being more than offset by the additional workers it gains, there is no apparent reason why this is anything less than a great strategy. I personally recommend that the Australian government should continue offering childcare subsidies for the foreseeable future. However, to increase awareness of them, I advise that a social media campaign should be launched advertising their existence. The third question described compulsory superannuation and requested that responders select the extent to which they agree that it makes working more appealing to them. I like question 2. Completely agree and slightly agree were both the most commonly selected answers, this time both at 35.7%, closely followed by neutral. These responses reinforce the benefits of superannuation and lead me to believe that much like childcare subsidies, compulsory superannuation should be a permanent inclusion in Australia's economic policies. I recommend that no changes should be made to the rate of compulsory superannuation currently. Question 4 described Australia's current policies on different forms of paid leave, and requested that responders select the extent to which they agree that they make working more appealing to them. An enormous 64.3% of respondents selected that they completely agree, and the remaining 43.8% all selected slightly agree. This illustrates that paid leave is the most appealing policy to Australians, meaning that by continuing to assure Australians that they'll still be able to receive an income when unfortunate circumstances arrive, the government is able to make Australians extremely enticed to work a full-time job. Although I would like to point out that our overly generous amounts of mandatorily paid leave inhibit the efficiency of our economy, reductions to them would be counterproductive in reducing unemployment. Therefore, I advise that any restrictions to paid leave should be kept to a minimum for the time being. Finally, question 5 described the Fair Work Commission and Ombudsman, and requested that responders select the extent to which they agreed that they make working more appealing to them. Exactly half the respondents selected that they completely agree, followed up with 31.3% selecting slightly agree, and the rest neutral. This shows that the enforcement of workplace laws is extremely important to Australians right now. And if we want to maintain our full-time employment rates, defunding these organisations is not an option. Rather, I advise that these organisations' funding should be increased in order to bring about better training for their staff as well as more staff for them in general. This should improve the rate at which they can tackle workplace issues and reduce voluntary resignations in Australia.